Carl and Erik, thank you so much for joining for this conversation. How I'd like to proceed is I'd like to just ask you both the same question. And you don't even have to speak with each other. You can just answer the questions separately. I'll give you each a turn to respond. I'd like to keep the questions just simple to a yes or no response to help avoid confusion in our responses, if at all possible. So the questions should be pretty simple to say yes or no. I do appreciate you both joining. Erik, you have really specific history with mold illness and also very specific military training that has helped you identify when you're in the presence of a dangerous anything. I guess I don't know a ton about your training, but I know that little bit just as an introduction to who Erik is. Erik as a person who's been injured from mold, who has learned a lot through his exposure experience, and he also has a very specific type of training that's helped him connect the dots. Carl is an air quality expert for years and years, and so Carl knows kind of the air quality side of things. So I feel like we have two people who don't always agree with each other publicly. I've noticed going through some of the different threads and comments, there can be so much gray area that I think it prevents us from moving forward with maybe making ground or having even a solid foundation to continue a conversation. When some terms aren't used consistently. And so I guess I just thought maybe we could hammer down some of these questions as a way of having a common ground of how to talk about mold, because I think we all agree that damp indoor spaces and mold growth can poorly affect our health. And maybe that's all the foundation we have. So I guess I was hoping we could maybe make a little bit more common ground just in terms of creating dialogue that can be used across the board, and also in terms of moving forward with helping the many people that are injured. So Erik, I kind of explained this, but briefly, you have been sick from mold exposure, that's correct?
Yeah, ever since 1964.
Okay. And Carl, have you ever been sick from a mold exposure?
Yes, I have, but not just mold, but also a number of other things and plus combinations. One quick question: who is Chemical Free Gal that's also on this?
Chemical Free Gal, gal, she has, I don't know her personally. I'm not sure exactly who she is. We follow each other on social media and follow each other's content. And I honestly didn't know anyone would be able to join this conversation after I had updated the link with both of you. So I was pleasantly surprised that anyone was even here.
Oh, I can come off if it's a private one. I'm sorry, I thought it was a public event. So
oh, this is a public event and you're welcome to join. And thank you for being here.
Yeah, I followed Erik for years, and so we interchanged over the last couple of years on Twitter and through Facebook, and I learned about him through Lisa about 4 or 5 years ago and admire Erik greatly. And Carl and I have exchanged emails in previous years, but my first name is Mariana, so you probably remember me through that. But
Oh, okay, thank you.
yeah, I've been injured by mold, and I reach out and help dozens of people the last 12 years that have been injured by mold and indoor air quality. So thank you both.
Well, we appreciate your work on the other end of it too, because this is one of those things where it really takes a village. So without further ado, my first question, Erik, is Can some molds produce chemicals?
Absolutely. Um, Especially the so-called black molds like Stachybotrys and Chetomium that have been tested and are known to produce neurotoxic substances that are extremely damaging when inhaled.
Carl, can some molds produce chemicals?
Of course, but chemicals is also a very, very broad term. There's volatile organics that growing mold can produce. There's mycotoxins that can sometimes be produced, which is chemical. And then there's some other complexities in there. So yeah, it's a very diverse it's a very diverse phenomena that yes, it can produce chemicals, and then you can further subdivide that into kinds of chemicals.
Oh, interesting. Thank you so much. Is it possible, Erik, we'll go back to you. Is it possible for there's one person on an iPhone that wants to come into the waiting room, so we're gonna just let them in. Erik, is it possible for the chemicals emitted by mold to cause injury?
Well, anecdotally, we see that that's definitely the case, yes.
Okay. Carl, is it possible for the chemicals emitted by mold to cause injury?
Erik, could you speak up a little bit louder? I'm having trouble hearing, or I can plug in ahead some earpieces.
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, thanks. And again, injury is such a broad term that it needs to be and can be, further differentiated. What kind of injury, whether it's a mild, moderate, severe, disabling, life-threatening, whether it can be allergy, asthma, affect the immune system, whether it's the VOCs, the volotoxins, or the mycotoxins, or other components associated with the dampness. It can certainly cause harm.
Well,
then we have to be a little more specific about what those harms are and what we call injury.
So there's so many different layers of injury that it's just a really broad term, but it can cause so many different layers of injury, really.
Yeah, it's kind of like talking about if you're in a car crash, can that cause injuries? But yeah, all kinds of injuries to all parts of the body at different severities. Some are acute, some are chronic. So I'm just making the point that one of the points that I think is often confused when I respond to people is we tend to use very broad terms like you have in a very generic way, so that when you talk about injury and Erik talks about injury and I talk about injury and somebody else on the group here talks about injury and we aren't clear about what injury we're talking about, then we start cross-talking and get confused and say, no, that's not right. That's wrong. No, I'm right. You're wrong.
I actually love that you pointed it out, because the reason I asked these questions is I noticed there was so much of that happening about the word toxic mold. So I looked up the definition of toxic mold, and it's something that if it's toxic, it can produce a chemical, and if it's toxic, you can be injured by that chemical. So it looks like we all agree that we can actually use the term toxic mold, which is a relief because it's so confusing when some people say we can't say toxic mold or we have to say toxigenic mold, and it all seems a little bit like playing with words and avoiding the truth that toxic mold can emit chemicals and they can cause injury, although that injury is very diverse. So I'm just glad that we're all on the
Since I'm the one that started that controversy by saying that toxic mold doesn't exist.
Did you say that?
Yeah, I posted that.
That toxic mold doesn't exist.
Yes.
Okay.
But I need to explain context. Context is so important to all this. The context that I responded to had to do with the medical professionals, researchers, and that sort of thing. And I could have been a little more clear if I had said to them, it doesn't exist, because they look at the very strict definition, the scientific and medical definition of toxicity, that sort of thing. And to them, toxic means always, where toxigenic means it can be. And in terms of mycotoxins, molds don't always produce mycotoxins. It's a secondary metabolite, which means that it doesn't always produce it. So therefore, it can't be toxic, correctly spoken, toxic mold, but it can be toxigenic mold. Then there has to be, when you encounter mold, mold growth, dampness, etc., then further saying that mycotoxins aren't the only toxins. So yeah, mold can certainly become toxic. The conditions that it's growing in can definitely be toxic and produce other toxins. So we have to be very careful, and I'm partly guilty on this on the Facebook groups too. When I talk about toxic or toxigenic, I'm usually I'm limiting it to mycotoxins, but really, because to get into, like I'm saying right now, to get into all the other toxicity issues, it gets complicated. It's hard to convey in words, in a text or a Facebook post or something like that. So since I started that controversy, I wanted to make that clarification, that there's more to toxic than mycotoxin, and the strict definition, and we don't have to talk about, when you and I and Eric and others talk, we don't have to use the strict terms. But if we start getting into disagreements, we start getting into misunderstandings, then I think it helps to back up and say, okay, how are you using this word? What do you mean by toxic mold versus toxigenic mold? Let's get those definitions and clarifications straightened out so we're talking about the same thing.
I agree. So,
If I can speak on that.
I think Eric should respond.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you go into the emergency room, you've just had an automobile crash. You don't know what kind of injury you've got. Is it blunt force trauma? Is it a concussion? Is it broken glass? You know, was your leg ripped off? So basically, it's okay to just go in and say, I've been in a car crash, I've had an accident, without specifying what it is, and leave that to be worked out later. And in terms of this toxic, since you don't know, using a broad term to get your foot in the door is a good way to start the conversation.
Well, to use your example, if I go into a doctor and I tell them that it's toxic mold, that doctor, he or she, often has two responses. One is, how do you know? And the other is, there's no such thing as toxic mold. And oftentimes that's what they've heard, and they haven't made the distinction of terms either about toxic versus toxigenic. They just hear certain things, and they've been out of medical school for 10, 20, 50 years or so. So regardless of what the words are and how they're used, it always helps to, if there's a disagreement or a confusion, just back up and say, okay, what are you saying? What are the words you are using? How are you using that? Whether it's with the doctor or you and I or an emergency room or anything else. Because when you go in the emergency room with a car crash, you can say my leg hurts, but you don't. It's not accurate to say it's broken unless the bone's sticking out. We try to be so precise and direct doctors, especially, on what is wrong with us, because, and it's a lot of it's their fault because they don't understand a lot of this, and we don't have authoritative support for what we are doing. One of the powerful things that you do, Eric, is that you provide that support for people so that they can understand, and they don't have to go through that, oh my God, is it real? Is it imaginary? Or am I going to be accused of something? But that lack of authoritative acknowledgement and support pushes us into the realm of, I've got to go in and convince. I got to convince the insurance adjuster this is mold, this is toxic mold or toxigenic mold or what, and they just back off. The worst thing that we can do when we get into a dispute like that, medical, insurance, or legal or whatever, is to use the 4-letter word mold. If you start with water damage, if you start with car wreck, then you have a better chance of them at least starting to hear you, and then you can get into the fine tuning of it. That at least that's my position. That's what I've been doing.
Eric, do you have a response to that before we?
Yeah, back in the 1990s, when people started becoming ill from toxic mold or from some unknown substance in their house, they would point at the offending substance and take samples of it and put it in a Ziploc bag and take it to their doctors and ask, what is this? It's making me sick. They go, well, that's just mold. It's an allergen. Well, finally, people managed to bypass doctors, get this substance into the hands of mycologists and some researchers, and lo and behold, it was a powerful toxic mold, Stachybotrys, in fact. So it was perfectly appropriate to say, look, this is a mold and I believe it's toxic, because it turned out that that's exactly what it was.
The only difference that I have with you on that, Eric, is that Stachybotrys is not the only mold of concern.
No, but it's a good way to get your foot in the door.
Well, sometimes, yes. When I've worked with people over the last 30 years, Stachybotrys is a common problem in houses in particular, but it's not the only one. And about 30% of my clients have no mold problems at all. Their symptoms and complaints, even though it appears to be like mold, or they describe it as mold related, it's not mold. I can't find mold or dampness there, Stachybotrys or otherwise. And when I address other issues, particularly chemicals, fragrances, cleaning products, personal care products, things like that, we remove those from the house, then their symptomology decreases or goes away completely. So that's part of the background on why I say that, yes, Stachybotrys can be a very serious issue, but it's not the only issue. And when I've worked with people like I say, over the last 30 years or so, there's a certain percentage that have nothing to do with mold, but it's confused. And one of the reasons, because those mycotoxins in cleaning or not mycotoxins, the VOCs in cleaning products, personal care products, and now with COVID, disinfectants in those VOCs are the same molecule that's in the VOCs, some of the VOCs that mold produces when it's actively growing. So our body doesn't know whether it came from mold or hand sanitizer or a cleaning product or a fragrance or whatever. That molecule is in our body and it reacts to that molecule. Then we, with our training and our experience, identify it according to what we understand and what we know. Those that I've worked with that are mold centric, that focus on mold, attributed to mold. The ones of my clients that are chemically intolerant only, or they started out as with chemical intolerance, they identify the same situation as chemical, not mold. In fact, I had a client, this was from over 20 years ago, was standing in the bedroom of the house. The person is very sick, the husband, the wife, and myself, and we all agreed the problem was in the master bedroom. One of us said, yeah, it's mold. The other one said, no, it's formaldehyde. And a third one, I won't identify which one of us said what, but the third one said, no, it's hand lotion. So we have to be very careful about how we attribute what is causing those symptoms. So that's a little background on what, but that in no way diminishes the effect of mold. It in no way diminishes the effect and the power of Stachybotrys. All I'm doing is I'm expanding that universe to say, especially if you work on mold and you can't get satisfaction, you can't get it sufficiently, then maybe you ought to look at something else and see if that's also part of the issue. And if it is, great. And if it's not, and it's still mold, that's fine. I don't have a problem with any of that. It's just let's take a look at let's take a look at the whole picture if we need to. Is my position.
Well, that's exactly the position that the Center for Disease Control took when they were examining the original chronic fatigue syndrome cluster. They didn't attach any particular importance to the mold. And since people were pointing at formaldehyde, at carpet fumes, at copier fumes, and just about everything else, they said, well, it's a toxic soup. There's many other factors. We need to take all these into account. And we don't want to attach importance to the mold because as far as we know, there's nothing in the literature that supports any adverse health effects from this. And yet, if you analyze the situation, none of the other substances had increased or in concentration. There was no more formaldehyde in the room. There was no more carpet fumes and very big. Were complaining about it. The only thing that had changed was the mold. The mold grew, and then people started pointing in all directions. So it seemed to me that since all these others were a fixed value, look at what changed, and that was the black mold.
I want to recount a quick story that because you hit on a very important point there, Eric, about the CDC, and they start looking at every other thing. And this is an area that I have a little bit of angst with myself. When you go back about 20, 30 years before the harm from cigarette smoking was finally resolved, at least in the courts, there was a group called CIAR, the Center for Indoor Air Research. And myself and a couple others joined together, and we actually sent in a study proposal to them that was rejected. Only to find out that that group wasn't really, they wanted to look at what all is going on indoors, okay? Only to find tobacco, to the point you're making with CDC, that there's some accusations there of, let's find everything else that's going on so then we can take the heat off of cigarettes or we can take the heat off of mold. So when I make some of these challenges, I sometimes feel like I'm aware that I may be giving that impression that I'm trying to distract from the central focus. And I don't mean to do that. But at the same time, if I don't do that, then people that focus only on mold or only on Stachybotrys, they run around in circles like a dog chasing its tail, trying to get some help and get some relief. When what would give them some relief is to look at maybe another option.
I have a
Well,
question.
for purposes of discovery, it's necessary to look at one thing at a time. And since the toxic mold wasn't even known, it wasn't in the literature back in 1985, in order to unveil this effect, one needed to be very narrow in their focus, determine what had changed, and find out if that substance, if that black mold had the capacity to result in the types of illness that we were observing. And as it turns out, it did.
Yeah, I agree. But you need to look at one thing at a time. There's a movement now that would dispute that, called system science, based on systems and the relationships of things, but that's for another time. But my response to you would say, yes, I agree, but let's not look at just one thing or just the first thing that we come across. Sometimes it helps when there's other evidence, particularly clinically or experientially, if we focus on whether it's mold or chemical intolerance. If we focus only on that and we hit a plateau or we can't get better or it's not working, we need to expand our horizons and try something else. So yes, I totally agree. We need to look at one thing at a time. But what I would add is let's not limit it to just that one thing.
Okay, we're going to talk about looking at the one thing at a time in just a second. But before we get to that, what I want to ask, Eric, this is mostly for you, and this is not and Carl, you're welcome to contribute too, but I feel like this is something that I've read Erik write before. And this was not a question on my list, but it came up listening to you two discuss just now, because Carl, you're bringing up the chemical fragrance. And I know a lot of people who are in mold exposure for very long actually develop multiple chemical sensitivities, and it tends to be a root cause of how this sensitivity develops. Erik, you have a contact, you have a story, you know of a case of a woman who was, I believe it was a woman who was investigating chemicals and was really sick, and towards the end of her career just went nosedive into researching mold.
Yeah, that was Cindy During of the Chemical Injury Information Network. She was working with Cynthia Wilson and Dr. Jack Thrasher on pesticides, formaldehyde, various chemicals as the primary motivating force in multiple chemical sensitivity. Cindy herself was poisoned by a pesticide exposure, and she was tested for it, and super high levels were found in her system. So it seemed like a very logical thing to pursue, and that's what she did for many years. But she kept getting worse and worse. And after researching all the possibilities, literally 2 months before she passed away, she completely dropped her focus on chemicals and put all of her efforts into studying mold. And Dr. Thrasher and Cynthia Wilson thought she had gone absolutely crazy. But when I look at my own experience, my hyperreactivity to specific mold and how avoiding it completely eradicated my multiple chemical sensitivity, it seems to me that her situation was very much like mine. She finally reached a point where she was so sensitive that she was able to discern that contamination was entering her safe zone and remained as a driving force in her upregulated immune system. And unfortunately, she got no support in that, so all of her research was lost.
Carl, do you have a response to that before we move along?
Oh, I familiar with that story. I'm familiar with Cindy, and I actually knew her. And I had Erik's got it right.
We are making headway on common ground here, you guys. I'm really excited.
The question for me is, once you've been upregulated by some cytokine exposure, be it a virus or a bacteria, a mycoplasma, your immune system is jacked up. Can this create a priming event that leaves you so reactive to these toxic molds that from that point on, they assume the motivating force, the driving force in your continued inflammatory response? Now,
I
anecdotally,
agree with that. There's another phenomenon attached with this that Claudia Miller in particular has studied, and it's what she's terming as toxicant-induced loss of tolerance. So regardless of what the original initiating event is, and we just finished a study with her that we're looking at what the initiating events are now. It expands beyond just the initial trigger, whether it's mold or a VOC, a pesticide, the oil field of the first Gulf War, the pesticides that was in the soldiers' uniforms, or the combination, or what all those things are. Once that initiating event happens, the body is now damaged in certain ways. I'm talking in generalities again. We can fine tune what all those are in generalities to where it now reacts to other kinds of chemicals. It reacts to even non-chemicals. I liken it to the straw that breaks the camel's back. If you got a camel and it's loaded with 1,000 pounds of lead and 1,000 pounds of feathers, and its back breaks, you get rid of the lead or you get rid of the feathers. Well, it doesn't make any difference. 1,000 pounds is 1,000 pounds. And you could put something else on there and it's still weight. The camel's back is broken. It's damaged. It can't tolerate other things. whether it's the initial initiating event or anything else. It needs to unload. It needs to stop the exposure, like Erik says, so the body can heal, and then gradually later take on some more weight, whatever that is. So, yes. Again, I think the main, excuse me, the main difference that I see on our common ground is that I've expanded the piece of ground that I'm talking about from what Erik is, and one of my pieces of evidence is the work of Nicholas Ashford and Claudia Miller with chemical intolerance and the tilt phenomenon.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Claudia Miller and the tilt concept, because one of the most famous clusters of mystery illness, the basis for chronic fatigue syndrome, was a casino down at South Shore, Harveys Casino. About 60 employees at this casino, not guests, but employees, got sick at the blackjack station, the card where all the dealers are basically doing their thing out on the casino floor. And Claudia Miller investigated that. She was the only researcher who ever looked into this. And she eventually concluded that it was due to a cockroach problem in the kitchen. They were literally using gallons of various pesticides, about 3 different varieties, and they were soaking the floor of the kitchen with all these different, this cocktail of chemicals. And here is what really strikes me as interesting about that incident. The people working in the kitchen did not get sick. It was the dealers and the people out on the casino floor that got sick. They were directly under a vent. So how does it happen that the people in direct proximity to all the pesticides did not become ill, and all the people out on the casino floor did under this vent? Well, it turns out that they had a toxic mold problem in their heating and ventilation system, and they were undergoing a remediation at the time. So here again, we had another example of people who would not otherwise be reactive to or susceptible to chemicals, but in combination with the toxic mold, became permanently ill.
Yeah, I agree, and that's a situation of the combination. So we can't say it's mold. We can't say it's the pesticide. We have to say it's the combination of the two.
So it was actually a diversion to focus on the pesticides and treat that as the cause, because without the catalyst of the toxic mold, they would not have become permanently ill.
Okay, but if you start on the other side and start with the mold, but don't include the pesticides, then were there any other areas where there was not the pesticides included that was just mold coming out of vents?
Well, I agree that in this situation, it was the synergism between the two that resulted in the illness. So the toxic mold by itself did not appear to result in any specific illness. However, there have been cases where the toxic mold, where Stachybotrys by itself, with no apparent chemicals, did result in permanent damage.
Yes, and I agree with that. I've seen that with my clients in my work, but I've also seen it where there was no Stachybotrys.
Well, if you examine the original chronic fatigue syndrome cohort, the teacher cluster, they got sick at work, and they somehow brought enough of this substance home with them that they would continue to be ill and even make other people ill just from what was carried on them. So to my way of thinking, this still put the focus back on whatever substance could be transported that was so toxic that it opened up a window of opportunity for other pathogens to make an impact.
Right. I agree with that.
And of course, in order to get research and attention on this particular substance, I have to put a name on it, and that's Stachybotrys chartarum.
Okay, I would put a different name on it. Talking about the same phenomena, but a different name. Sometimes, not always.
And what is this name?
Well, it depends on what the other part of it is. What I have trouble understanding is, with all the variabilities and all the other factors and everything else, you always come back to just mold, just Stachybotrys, and that even though there's complications and other things involved with it, it's still Stachybotrys. And what I'm saying is that, yeah, that happens, but there's also other times where there's no Stachybotrys involved and we still have the same effects. There's times where there's no mold involved and
That goes
we
back
have
to
the
my
same
military
effects.
training.
So it's just, there's more than one thing that accounts for mold, and just mold, and you get rid of it and people are fine with it, no problem at all.
Yeah, I was in the Army during the Cold War in Germany, and I was trained in biological warfare. And our training said that the Soviets are obviously going to be developing new substances to use on us. So we need to be on the lookout for anything that's unusual, that they were going to mix up a lot of different agents to try to keep us as confused as possible. So if you observe anything acting strangely, that this is what you focus on, this is what you report to headquarters, and this is what you isolate for study. In particular, for radiological warfare, if something was introduced into your environment that was radioactive, be it a helmet, anything that had been exposed to radiation, soldiers would get sick around it in an unusual way. And of course, whatever problems they were having with nerve agent, with mustard gas, with anything else was going to be worse. But you had to look at the proximity to whatever had been introduced to hone in on the pattern of why people were complaining in a new way that was unfamiliar. And in this way, it leads you back to that one object, that one substance that you can finally take to the lab and figure out why something has changed. So I used the same procedure for the toxic mold. I isolated a sample of it. I had it tested, found out what it was, took it out to the desert. And once I got myself feeling well, did proximity experiments to find out if I could reproduce the effects that it had on me to this one substance alone. And I could. So that means that it's the primary object of study, and anything that detracts from that is preventing further research into why this substance has this amazing capability.
This is actually a very real problem when we're talking about things like chronic fatigue and chronic fatigue syndrome, because this is another thing where I'm not seeing consistent language. And for patients and for people suffering, I think that this is a big problem. I'm seeing chronic fatigue used as this catch-all term. Sorry if I'm screaming. I just realized my voice might be really loud. I was kind of trying to like interrupt too, so I was trying to use a stronger tone. I'm noticing that chronic fatigue is very often used as this catch-all term. And there's a difference between chronic fatigue as a symptom and the 1988 Holmes chronic fatigue syndrome. One explains persistent tiredness, and one is a term coined by the CDC to solve a very specific incident. And my concern with not using the term correctly is, I think here we all know that Stachybotrys was the one thing that wasn't looked at when the CDC originally investigated this situation. And when we're overlooking a major contributing factor to what was happening in that timeline, and we're not solving it because we're ignoring a key player, we can't just take that phrase and apply it to everything and say everything has that, because the original term hasn't been solved. You'd have to solve the original syndrome and say what was related to it before you could then take this and apply it to everything. And what I see is some key research not looked at the symptoms summarized, and then that given to doctors as anyone who has these symptoms has this name. And it seems like a really backwards way to confuse people about how their environment can make them ill. Erik, can you comment on that? And then Carl?
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Paul Cheney was scared into calling the Center for Disease Control by clusters of sick teachers in several schools and a group of people in a casino, not the one I was referring to. There was another casino in Incline Village that had some sick employees. And the Center for Disease Control finally sent 2 epidemiologists, John Kaplan and Gary Holmes, to investigate the situation, which at the time looked like an inexplicable activation of Epstein-Barr virus. These teachers and the casino employees were bursting forth with the normal kissing disease, the glandular fever, the rite of passage that everybody gets when they start making out and acquire this Epstein-Barr virus and have a 4 to 6 week viral illness, which eventually goes away, and you never have it again because you've developed immunity. All of a sudden, these adults are lighting up with Epstein-Barr virus, and it's not going away. The tests show that after 6 months, even a year, their Epstein-Barr virus titers are still jacked up. They're still sick. They're not getting better. What is going on? Dr. Cheney calls the CDC. They come out and they look in these schools and they don't find anything, even though the people in these schools were pointing directly at mold, specifically asked for help with the mold. They looked in their medical literature. There was nothing to be found. That's because toxic mold at this time had not yet been discovered, was not entered into the literature. So they went ahead and developed a research definition, which they called chronic fatigue syndrome. It was authored by Dr. Gary Holmes, and it was a specific result of his investigation and the fact that he was baffled by these clusters of sick teachers. But as soon as the vague definition was coined, people, doctors looked at that and said, oh, well, it's characterized by chronic fatigue. This means that this refers to anything that has to do with chronic fatigue. And they completely forgot that it was this investigation that had caused the creation of the syndrome. Whereas if they had gone back to the source, to these very schools, to the casino, they would have found that after the researcher had given up, that the casino owners, that the school authorities had called mold testers to come find out what was going on. And they did identify a particular mold, Stachybotrys, in all these cases, in all these instances. And after I heard of 3 repetitive times where the same black mold was identified, where the mystery illness was, I go, that's enough of a pattern that we should focus on that one particular mold and find out why it's showing up so often in conjunction with this mystery illness.
Right, and I agree with that procedure. My addition to that is that there are also other situations where Stachybotrys is not involved. And we shouldn't focus on just one thing. Going back to your statement, Keely, about chronic fatigue, yeah, that's a big problem because people misuse the term. And that's one of the, I guess, kind of pet peeves that I have in this and other areas is the misuse of the terms, including whether it's toxic mold or toxigenic mold. It creates confusion, and then people take those words and definitions, apply it their own way, particularly on the Facebook groups, and then get very upset if anybody says anything that doesn't strongly 100% support them. And so what I try to do is provide some of the distinctions or clarifications in there. And to be quite honest, I get pushback from some people on the groups, but I also get a lot of private messages too, saying, thank you. Do I really have to do this? Do I have to do it that way? my situation isn't that extreme, or I just can't do it. I've got 3 kids and, you know, we're out of work now. We got COVID, the sickness and stuff coming on. So I'm looking at how do we customize responses to that person's situation rather than just one size fits all kind of thing. Just as a reminder, Keely, I have a hard stop on the hour and I need a couple of minutes before that so I can
Okay,
get on a
let me get one more question out of you, Carl, and then if you wanna leave, that's fine. But I just have one more question with indoor air
Sure.
quality. Can you tell me if the average indoor air quality test is going to provide a full, in-depth, complete scope analysis of all bacteria, all mycotoxins, all molds?
No,
It will not.
no, because first of all, there is no such thing as an indoor air quality test.
Okay,
There are
what's the right
tests.
way? What's the right way for me to say that then?
Okay, well, this is it's not just here among us, it's also among researchers and a lot of people that are out in the field. There are people out there, say, that go out.
Maybe a damp assessment would be better.
Well, that's still not in, look, the quality, think about, let's back up. We got air outside, we've got air inside, and we're looking at the quality of that air. So what are the things that affect the quality of that air? First of all, the ones that the building scientists especially have looked at is temperature and humidity, air movement. Is it too drafty? Is it stale and stagnant?
That's why I want to know if there's a test that exists that can tell me without a doubt every single mold and every single mycotoxin in my house. That's what
No, because we don't know what all the molds are, number one. Number two, not all the molds can be detected with the same test. There's at least 16 different variations of mold testing out there, and they all give you a different result.
And what about limitations in mycotoxin testing?
Again, similar limitations. The US people say there's 400 mycotoxins, and the Australians say there's at least 600. The labs only test for certain ones, just like they test, they look for only specific set of molds in the lab because those are the ones that are most common. Okay, those are the ones we're most concerned with. The problem then becomes what we're most concerned with now becomes that's all there is.
Okay. And when we're checking for molds in the house and we're finding molds, we're not getting answers to what mycotoxins could be present with those molds in the house because we're not testing for that.
That's right. You have to test for the mycotoxin
separately.
And, yeah. And then there's two mycotoxins. There's a urine test, but that's only what's in the body, regardless of where it came from.
Yeah, no, I mean just house. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm recommending to people, and it's only partial, is you can do the urine test, but also then do a dust test for mycotoxins. If there are mycotoxins in the urine that are not in the dust, then that's evidence that those mycotoxins are not coming from mold or that dust sample, or at least from that house. And one of the other sources of mycotoxins is from food.
I noticed that a lot of the mycotoxin tests are actually testing for mycotoxins that are really easy to say are from food. But thank you for pointing that out. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah, there's a lot more to this, and I really appreciate you doing this. And Erik, I appreciate you, and I would like to suggest that we have a second session because there's some other information that needs to be talked about, and for me, it's really helped me to understand Erik better, and I hope it's helped him to understand me and anybody that is participating or listening in. I notice this is being recorded. Are you going to make the recording available?
Do I have your permission to share it?
Yes. Yes, you do.
Erik, do I have your permission to share it?
Yes.
Okay, then yes.
Okay, and I'd like a follow-up on this.
I think as long as if Erik agrees, I'm open to that as well. So thank you for your time, Carl.
You've done a masterful job. Thank you, and thank you, Erik.
I
have to leave now.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, Erik, is there anything that I missed that you'd like to wrap up with, or anything that you'd like to dive into a bit more before we wrap up?
Well, yeah, I didn't, I was surprised that Carl brought up the Tilt Claudia Miller investigation, but I think that's one of the most fascinating things that you could ever analyze is how the pesticides in high concentration in one room wound up causing illness in a completely separate room with only the avenue of being transported through the ventilation system as a factor. I think we could learn a lot from that.
I'm just hypothesizing, and I'm just gonna bounce this off of you and you can give me your opinion, but one thing that I know about, I don't know this from testing because I can't prove it with testing, but I feel like I know it with my experience. When I'm around mycotoxins, my face will burn, I'll get very confused. It feels like a chemical burn, and I'm wondering if the chemicals from the pesticide are triggering like internal chemicals from the people who are close to the mycotoxins under the vent, and if are those chemicals playing off of each other or working together to weaken the system, or is, I mean, do you think that's like it's a chemical injury and then other chemicals are making it worse, or am I way off base? Like, what do you think? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I'm not really sure I understand your question.
Oh, okay. I guess my question was, is there a chemical injury caused from mold exposure? And then do other chemicals worsen that?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about that. But what's the nature of this injury? Why is this happening? Why is it that no amount of chemicals seem to be capable of causing this kind of induced hyperreactivity?
Right. What's special about this chemical that would injure you so badly that would make all other chemicals unbearable?
Yeah. And when we see a consistent pattern to this onset of illness, we have to narrow down our focus. So we've got to have some leads, what we can do further research into. But yeah, we found with the discovery of the innate immune system in the 1990s that you can have a self-replicating immune response that is not an allergy. It's a direct response to a chemical exposure. And it seems to be this new branch of immunology that is telling us that once triggered, the cytokine cascade, the runaway response, has a life of its own. And each subsequent exposure, even though it may be extremely slight, is preventing the immune system from calming down again.
Well, anyone who's been in and out of Stachybotrys knows that that's exactly what happens. I mean, you get into it and you know because you feel it even if you can't see it.
Sure, a few molecules seem to be enough to trigger a relapse.
Yes. Erik, is there anything you'd like to add? I just want to say thank you for your time today, and also just invite you to say any closing words before we wrap up if you'd like.
I think we've covered it pretty well, and this is fascinating stuff, and I hope we can continue on with it.
Well, we did better than the presidential debate, so
Yeah,
that's a win.
no name calling.
Erik, thank you for your time. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye.